The Bible doesn't tell us whether the limp, the injury that Jacob received was a permanent one. If it was something that followed him throughout his entire life. But if I were him, I would hope that it would be. It can be so hard to be mindful of God. And to have a limp, a scar, a reminder of a time when we encountered God in a time of distress would be wonderful and an excellent way to constantly draw our consciousness to the presence of God in our lives. Jacob called out to God for a blessing. Give me a blessing. This man, we assume, was an agent of God, so his actions under law could be attributable to God, his employer. Am I correct, Michael? Thank you. So Jacob called out for a blessing. And we said, well, why? I mean, if you look at our scoundrel Jacob, over the past few chapters of Genesis, well, he got his brother's birthright. That's nice. He got his brother's blessing reserved for the oldest son. He tricked his dad out of that one. And then when he was in exile, he had a dream, remember, where he saw angels going up and down the ladder, and God spoke to him and said, "You've got a brighter tomorrow." What more could he need? And yet Jacob cried out for a blessing. Jacob is a strident figure in the Bible. He's not a terribly sympathetic figure in the Bible. And he's larger than life. He's iconic. And so it may be hard for us to relate to him. But who was he really? He was a brother. He was a son. Presumably a member of an extended family. And acting out of self-interest, he threw all of that away. He was estranged from his family. He was exiled. He was alone. And even knowing that, he, in today's reading, is on the cusp of reuniting with a brother who understandably would be very angry with him. And in chapters just prior to our reading, it says that Esau, his brother, is going to show up with 200 men. He's either going to get a really nice greeting or a heck of a pounding. For anybody who has experienced estrangement or difficulties in their family, it's painful. I've seen it in people's lives. And even if it's been a necessary step to distance yourself from a family member, well, is that the preferred reality? Wouldn't we rather have a family that's all together? However you define that family, a group of friends, or your biological family, your extended family. And I think that the desolation that Jacob was experiencing, despite the booty he had escaped with, the blessing, the birthright, even having seen God in this vision, it had been a terrible time. And he was filled with fear about what was coming next. During his time in exile, you might remember that Jacob was looking for work. He met a woman while he was working, before he started work for her dad, and fell in love with her and proposed and was going to get married. But the dad said, look, put in 7 years of labor and I'll allow you to marry her. 7 years, I think it was 7. And 7 years later, they lift the veil and it's the wrong woman. Because he's trying to get rid of the daughter. All right? This is not a pretty story. And then Laban, the father, says, look, I'll cut you a deal. 7 more years and you can have the original one that you were for. So 14 years, hard labor, ends up with 2 wives, wanted one. And then even he became estranged from that family as accusations of mishandling of sheep were leveled against him. His life was not a good one. Strident, maybe, but can you imagine the hell that he lived with? And so he called out for a blessing. I'm reacquainting myself this week with Viktor Frankl. And how many people here had to study Viktor Frankl? All right. So feel free to shout out if I misstate anything. But Viktor Frankl was a person who was exiled and estranged as a result of being taken away by the Nazis and put into the death camps. Most of his family was killed. His position as a philosopher and a therapist were stripped, although they allowed him to keep up a practice in the death camp as a therapist. And that was such a part of his identity. And he saw people dying in the death camps. And they were either killed or they would simply deteriorate. Have you ever seen somebody just deteriorate? I lost a friend a few weeks ago who just gave up. And that's what he saw on a constant basis. The people, for some reason, would just give up and be curious about this. And he said, what makes a difference between a person who survives day to day in this awful circumstance and those who can't take it? He figured, ultimately, that for himself it was, if he saw himself collecting all these hideous experiences and planning for the day he would return to a classroom, leave the death camp, return to a classroom, he could share all these experiences with people. So he used to practice in front of imaginary classes. What happened during the course of the day, he would turn it into a lecture. He would make meaning of it. Another thing he did was he noticed that in his fellow detainees, but also in his own life, if he could remember somebody, living or dead, who cared for him, if he could remember that God cared for him, he could also collect and narrate these things. These are the stories that I can tell God on a daily basis. These are the stories that I'm going to tell my cousin when I get out of here. That somehow he was able to put meaning around what he was experiencing and shape his experience and constantly hope for the future. He went on to write Man's Search for Meaning, which is a classic text that I ask anybody to read if you're going through difficult times. And he formed a major school of psychology, logotherapy, in Vienna. And I wonder how much fame he would have obtained had he not experienced what he did. God gave him this blessing in the form of this insight. But for the rest of his life, he had this horrible scar to carry with him in the form of the memories of what he saw. Blessings sometimes come out sideways, not in ways that we would expect them to. How is an out-of-joint hip a blessing? Jacob, now Israel, would remember God. How could we possibly say that what Viktor Frankl went through was a blessing? That's an even tougher one. Because did God cause that war, that prejudice, those death camps? This is where we wrestle with God. Did God sit idly by? And we continue to wrestle. Did God cause or sit idly by for 9/11? Did God cause or sit idly by for the shootings in Norway a couple weeks back? Did God cause or sit idly by as things got out of control in Somalia? And those poor folk are in the midst of a horrible famine. I want to believe no. And that's what I do believe. You have to wrestle with God on your own. But for me, that image of God, a God that would cause or sit idly by, is incongruent with the God who says, love all. Love God. Love your neighbor. Love yourself. Love your enemy. Tend to the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Care for, love this earth that supports all of us, including the animals, the creatures of this earth. Instead, I want to believe that when Genesis tells us God created us in God's image, it doesn't mean that we look like God. What it means is that we have in us a creative capacity to reach out into the times of darkness and chaos that occur in our lives and pull from it light. A light that comes forth in the form of us acting as God's feet, hands, eyes, ears, to find the solutions. To never forget to find solutions so that we don't have to repeat some of the acts we've lived through. We cry out for a blessing. And I think that's how I see God blessing us. I think that becomes our twisted blessing that comes out sideways. Our memory of these events, but then our engaging them, our changing the world. And our memory of these events reminds us that no matter how dark the experience, we were never alone. And we were never without God's help, God's blessings. Jacob was no longer Jacob. He was Israel. The name Jacob pointed to his old life. Israel meant you have striven with God and with humans, and you've prevailed. Yes, he was mindful of the fact that at the time of this reading, he was still exiled. He was still estranged. He had been through hard times. And there was a chance that the next day he could be dead. Fast forward, he didn't die. Mindful of what was ahead of him. But nevertheless, he had this limp, this reminder of his encounter with God, and with each broken step that he took, he could remember, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. May we call out for a blessing in the time of need, each of us. May God bless us as we need. Amen.